It was a chilly, overcast morning in Chicago, the kind of day where the wind carried a bite, whistling through the narrow streets of the city. The sidewalks buzzed with the usual rush of commuters, their hurried steps blending with the hum of buses and the occasional honk of a car stuck in traffic. In a quiet corner of the Lincoln Park neighborhood, outside a small cafe called Clara's Brew, the scent of warm pastries and brewing coffee spilled out onto the street, wrapping passers-by in a comforting embrace. Amid this familiar scene, a scruffy black and white dog appeared, seemingly out of nowhere. He didn't belong to the urban hustle. His matted fur, streaked with dirt, clung to his thin frame, and his large, soulful hazel eyes held a quiet sorrow that seemed to hush the world around him. He wasn't barking or chasing after scraps. Instead, he sat patiently by the cafe's entrance, his gaze fixed on the people streaming in and out, as if searching for someone who might notice him. Inside the cafe, Clara, the owner, was busy arranging a tray of cinnamon rolls, their sugary aroma filling the air. She was a woman in her late 50s, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense attitude honed by years of running her small business. As she wiped her hands on her apron, she caught sight of the dog through the glass door. Her heart gave a little tug. Chicago was no stranger to stray animals, but this one was different. There was a stillness about him, a dignity that seemed out of place for a creature so clearly neglected. His eyes weren't just hungry, they were waiting, pleading for something more than food. Clara watched as he lifted a paw, hesitating as if he wanted to scratch at the door, but thought better of it. He sat back down, his gaze unwavering, as if he believed someone would eventually stop. The dog's presence didn't go unnoticed. A few customers paused as they left the cafe, their paper cups steaming in the cold air. An elderly man named Harold, a regular who always ordered a black coffee and a blueberry scone, stopped short. "Looks like my old mutt, Rusty," he muttered, his voice thick with nostalgia. "Had a dog just like that years ago. Broke my heart when he passed." A young woman in a hurry tossed a half-eaten croissant into a nearby trash can, glancing at the dog with a flicker of guilt before rushing off. But no one stopped to help. The city moved on, as it always did, swallowing small moments like this without a second thought. As the morning turned to afternoon, Clara kept an eye on the dog while she worked. She noticed how he didn't beg or whine, just sat there, his thin body shivering slightly in the damp air. By late afternoon, when the lunch rush had slowed, Clara couldn't ignore him any longer. She stepped outside to toss a bag of stale muffins into the dumpster, and the dog stood slowly, his movements careful, deliberate. He didn't rush toward her or jump for the food. Instead, he took a few cautious steps, stopping just close enough for his cold nose to brush against her hand. Clara froze. The touch was so gentle, so tentative, it felt like the world paused for a moment. The roar of the city, cars, voices, wind, faded away, leaving only her and this dog, his hazel eyes locking with hers. In that moment, Clara felt something stir deep inside her, a pang she couldn't quite name. This wasn't just a stray. This dog was waiting for someone, for something, for a chance to be seen. Clara crouched down, ignoring the chill of the pavement seeping through her jeans. "Hey there, fella," she said softly, her voice catching. "You're lost, aren't you?" The dog tilted his head, as if he understood every word. He didn't pull away or demand anything. He just stood there, his eyes steady, his silence louder than any bark. Clara reached out, her hand brushing his tangled fur. She could feel the sharp edges of his ribs beneath his skin, a sign of too many days without enough to eat. Yet there was a strength in him, a quiet resolve that refused to break. Clara's heart ached. She'd seen plenty of strays, but none had ever looked at her like this, as if they shared a secret she hadn't yet uncovered. Inside the cafe, a few customers watched through the window. A woman in a wool coat sniffed disapprovingly. "You can't let a filthy dog like that in here," she said as she grabbed her to-go order. "Health code violation, you know." Clara barely heard her. Something about this dog felt different, like a moment she was meant to notice. She stood, brushing off her hands, and made a decision. "Come on, buddy," she said, holding the cafe door open. The dog hesitated, his eyes searching hers as if he couldn't believe the invitation. Then slowly he stepped inside, his paws leaving faint, muddy prints on the wooden floor. Clara grabbed a rag, wiped up the mess, and led him to a corner near the counter, where he promptly lay down, exhausted but calm. She set out a bowl of water and a few bits of plain bread, watching as he lapped at the water with careful sips, as if savoring every drop. As Clara went back to work, she couldn't shake the feeling that this dog wasn't just a random stray. There was something about him, his quiet dignity, his patient gaze, that felt like a message she was meant to hear. She thought about her life, about the years she'd spent pouring everything into the cafe, keeping herself busy so she wouldn't have to think about the things she'd lost. There was a time when she'd had a dog, a scruffy black and white mutt named Pepper, who'd been her companion during her early 20s. Pepper had been her confidant, her shadow, until one day he'd slipped out the gate and never came back. Clara had searched for weeks, putting up flyers, calling shelters, but he was gone. The guilt still lingered, a quiet ache she'd buried under the daily grind of running her business. By the next morning, the cafe was busier than usual. Word had spread about the cafe dog, and curious locals stopped by, some for coffee, others just to see the scruffy newcomer. The dog, now curled up on an old blanket Clara had found in the back, watched the bustle with calm, attentive eyes. His presence seemed to change the air in the cafe, softening the usual rush. Regulars lingered longer, sharing stories about pets they'd loved and lost. One woman, Mrs. Delaney, a retiree who came in every morning for a latte, knelt beside the dog and smiled. "He reminds me of my old scout," she said, her voice warm with memory. "You keeping him, Clara?" Clara shrugged, wiping down the counter. "I don't know yet. He just showed up. Might belong to someone." But deep down, she wasn't so sure. The dog didn't act like he was lost. He acted like he was waiting. That evening, when the cafe was quiet, Clara sat on the floor beside the dog. She ran her hand through his fur, still matted but a little cleaner after a quick wipe down. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, she felt a connection so strong it startled her. "What's your story, huh?" she whispered. "What are you trying to tell me?" The dog rested his head on his paws, his gaze never leaving her. Clara felt a lump in her throat. She didn't know why, but she couldn't leave him at the cafe overnight. The thought of him alone in the cold was too much. So she made another impulsive decision. "Come on, buddy. You're coming home with me." Clara's apartment was a small, cozy place on the third floor of an old brownstone, just a few blocks from the cafe. As they walked through the city, the dog stayed close by her side, his steps steady and sure, as if he'd walked this path before. The streetlights cast a warm glow on the sidewalks, and the sounds of Chicago, cars, distant music, the chatter of late-night pedestrians, faded into the background. Clara noticed how the dog didn't pull on the makeshift leash she'd fashioned from an old belt. He walked with purpose, like a loyal companion who knew exactly where he belonged. When they reached her apartment, Clara opened the door, and the dog stepped inside, his eyes scanning the space with a quiet curiosity. He didn't sniff around or explore like most dogs would. Instead, he settled near the couch, lying down with a sigh that sounded almost relieved. Clara frowned, a strange feeling creeping over her. It was as if he'd been here before, as if this place was familiar. Shaking off the thought, she grabbed a towel and a bowl of warm water to clean him up. As she gently scrubbed his fur, she noticed something under the dirt, a faint scar around his neck, like the mark of a collar worn too tightly for too long. Clara's breath caught. "You belonged to someone, didn't you?" she murmured. The dog looked up at her, his eyes steady, and for a moment, she felt like he was answering her without words. As Clara settled onto the couch with a cup of tea, the dog lay at her feet, his breathing slow and even. The quiet of the apartment brought memories she hadn't thought about in years. She remembered Pepper, her old dog, and the way he'd always been there for her during the hardest times. Her early 20s had been tough, moving to Chicago alone, struggling to make ends meet, dealing with a breakup that had left her reeling. Pepper had been her anchor, his playful nudges and quiet presence pulling her through. Losing him had felt like losing a piece of herself, and she'd never quite forgiven herself for not finding him. Now, looking at this dog, Clara couldn't help but wonder if this was more than a coincidence. "You're not Pepper, are you?" she said, half laughing at the absurdity of the thought. The dog tilted his head, his eyes soft, and Clara felt a chill run down her spine. That night, as she tried to sleep, Clara heard a soft sound from the living room. She got up, her steps quiet, and found the dog sitting by the window, staring out at the street below. The city lights flickered, casting shadows across his fur. He wasn't whining or pacing, just watching, as if waiting for something or someone. Clara stood there, her heart heavy. "What are you looking for, buddy?" she whispered. The dog turned to her, his eyes catching the light, and in that moment, Clara felt a strange certainty. This dog wasn't just here by chance. He'd come into her life for a reason, one she was determined to uncover. The next morning, Clara woke to the sound of soft scratching at her apartment door. The dog was there, sitting patiently, his eyes bright with a quiet urgency. He didn't seem frantic, but there was a purpose in his gaze, as if he needed to go somewhere. "You want to go out, don't you?" Clara asked, rubbing her eyes. She grabbed her coat, clipped the makeshift leash onto his collar, and headed downstairs. As soon as they hit the street, the dog took the lead, walking with a confidence that surprised her. He didn't wander or sniff at every corner. Instead, he moved with purpose, guiding Clara through the bustling streets of Lincoln Park, past coffee shops and bookstores, until they reached a quieter part of the neighborhood. After about 20 minutes, the dog stopped in front of a small, overgrown park tucked between two apartment buildings. It was a place Clara had passed countless times but never really noticed. The park was little more than a patch of grass, a few benches, and a gnarled old oak tree that looked like it had stood there for decades. The dog sat down near one of the benches, his eyes fixed on the tree. Clara frowned, a strange feeling washing over her. "Why here?" she said softly, looking around. The park felt oddly familiar, like a memory she couldn't quite place. She sat on the bench, her mind racing, and then it hit her. This was the park where she used to take Pepper when she first moved to Chicago. It was where they'd spent lazy afternoons, where she'd tossed a tennis ball for him to chase, where she'd sat and cried when things felt too heavy. Her chest tightened. "You've been here before, haven't you?" she asked the dog, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked at her, his eyes calm and knowing, and Clara felt her heart skip a beat. As she sat there, an older man approached, carrying a bag of breadcrumbs for the pigeons. He stopped when he saw the dog, his face lighting up with recognition. "Well, I'll be," he said, his voice warm. "Haven't seen that fella in years." Clara turned to him, her heart pounding. "You know this dog?" she asked. The man nodded, tossing a handful of crumbs to the birds. "Used to see him around a shelter over in Uptown, a couple years back. They called him Shadow. Always thought he was waiting for someone. Never seen a dog so patient." Clara's mind reeled. "A shelter?" she asked. The man nodded. "Yeah, Uptown Hope Shelter. He showed up there looking rough, but he disappeared one day, like he had somewhere to be." The man's words stayed with Clara as she walked home, the dog, Shadow as the shelter had called him, by her side. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than a coincidence. That night she sat at her kitchen table with her laptop, searching for information about Uptown Hope Shelter. After a few clicks, she found their website, a simple page with a phone number and address. Her hands shook as she wrote it down. She glanced at the dog who was lying on the rug, watching her with those steady hazel eyes. "We're going to figure this out, buddy," she said, her voice firm. The next morning, Clara and the dog took a bus to Uptown. The shelter was a small, weathered building with a faded sign and a chain-link fence. A woman in her 60s with gray hair pulled into a bun greeted them at the gate. Her name tag read, Margaret. Clara explained how she'd found the dog and what the man in the park had said. Margaret looked at the dog and smiled. "Oh, I remember him," she said, her voice soft. "We called him Shadow. Showed up here about 3 years ago, skinny as a rail but sweet as can be. He stayed for a while, but one day he just left, like he knew he had somewhere to go." Clara's heart raced. "Did he belong to anyone?" she asked. Margaret shook her head. "Not that we could find, but he had this old collar with a tag, had a name on it, but it was so worn we could barely read it." Margaret disappeared into the shelter and returned with a small box. Inside was a battered metal tag, its edges rusted, but a name still faintly visible. Pepper. Clara's breath caught. "This was his?" she asked, her voice trembling. Margaret nodded. "Came with him when he arrived. We kept it. Figured it might mean something to someone." Clara took the tag, her fingers tracing the letters. It couldn't be. Pepper had been gone for over 20 years. The math didn't add up, the logic didn't hold. But as she looked at the dog sitting calmly beside her, she felt a certainty she couldn't explain. "Pepper," she whispered, and the dog's ears perked up, his eyes locking with hers. Clara felt tears welling up as she knelt beside him. "Is that you, boy?" she asked, her voice breaking. The dog leaned into her, his head resting against her shoulder, and for a moment, Clara felt like the world had stopped. It didn't matter if it was impossible. It didn't matter if the years didn't line up. This dog, whether he was Pepper or Shadow or something else entirely, had found his way to her, and she wasn't going to let him go again. Over the next few weeks, Clara and the dog, now officially Pepper, settled into a routine. She took him to the vet, got him a proper collar, and spoiled him with treats and a cozy bed by the cafe counter. The regulars loved him, bringing toys and sneaking him bits of muffin when Clara wasn't looking. But Clara couldn't shake the feeling that there was still a piece of the puzzle missing. One evening, while cleaning out an old storage closet in her apartment, she found a shoebox filled with mementos from her early days in Chicago. Inside was a photo of her and Pepper, taken in that same park where she'd found him sitting by the oak tree. She stared at the photo, her heart swelling. The dog in the picture was unmistakably like the one now lying at her feet. As the weeks turned into months, Clara began to dig deeper into Pepper's past. She tracked down the address listed on an old shelter form Margaret had given her, a street in Uptown where Pepper had been found. It led her to a small, rundown house with a for sale sign out front. A neighbor, an elderly woman with a kind smile, told Clara about the man who'd lived there, a loner named Mr. Thompson. "He had a dog like that one," the woman said, nodding at Pepper. "Loved him to pieces. Said the dog was waiting for someone special. When he passed away, the dog just vanished." Clara's heart ached as she pieced it together. Pepper had been cared for by someone else, someone who'd loved him but knew he belonged elsewhere. Somehow, through years and miles and impossible odds, he'd found his way back to her. One night, as Clara sat on her couch with Pepper curled up beside her, she noticed something she'd missed before. On the back of the old tag, barely legible, was an inscription. "Always find your way home." The words hit her like a wave, and she pulled Pepper close, tears streaming down her face. "You did it, boy," she whispered. "You found your way home." From that day on, Clara and Pepper were inseparable. He followed her to the cafe every morning, greeting customers with a wagging tail and those soulful eyes. The cafe became a warmer place, filled with stories and laughter, and Clara felt a lightness she hadn't known in years. She'd spent so long carrying the guilt of losing Pepper, but now, against all odds, they were together again. It wasn't about logic or explanations. It was about a bond that time couldn't break. One sunny morning, as Clara opened the cafe and Pepper settled into his usual spot, she looked at him and smiled. "We're home, aren't we?" she said. Pepper looked up at her, his eyes bright, and gave a soft woof as if to say, "Always." And in that moment, Clara knew they were exactly where they were meant to be, together at last. If you enjoyed this story, please give it a like and subscribe for more heartwarming tales.